Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Anatomy of an Industrial Attack. My name is Michelle Lara with Cloud Range. We're all really excited to be here and to see everyone who's joining us today. We've got a great team and are excited about what we have going on here at Cloud Range. Today's speakers are Mike Killian, Cloud Range Alliance's Director. He is an expert in the cybersecurity industry and a pioneer of cyber ranges, and he has over 25 years of experience leading enterprise initiatives at HP, Splunk, Elastic, and CompuWare. And with him is Pedro Martinez, Cloud Range Attack Master. Pedro's cybersecurity background includes being a signals intelligence and cyber operator in the U.S. Army, and he has over 20 years of experience supporting the DoD, the intelligence community, and the commercial sector. They will evaluate a recent attack on a water treatment plant and discuss key takeaways to be aware of in securing critical infrastructure. They will explain how organizations can understand attack vectors in the complex IT/OT threat landscape, accelerate IT/OT convergence, and ensure IT and OT security teams speak the same language. Before I turn it over to Mike and Pedro, a little bit of housekeeping. The webinar will be 30 minutes long and a recorded version of this webinar will be available. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please use the Q&A button on your Zoom toolbar and Mike and Pedro will answer questions at the end of the presentation. Without further ado, let me hand this off to Mike and Pedro.
Hey, thanks everyone. So in case you're not familiar with us, I've got just a couple slides to explain what we do here at Cloud Range. We were founded back in 2018, so going on 6 years now, by Debbie Gordon, who saw the need to make range environments more accessible. I mean, previously ranges were large on-prem implementations costing a whole lot of money to stand up and almost as much to maintain. Well, Debbie founded Cloud Range because there was a need really to upskill SOC and IR teams to gain experience on how to identify and remediate cyber attacks. And in doing so, we established a new category in cybersecurity. Since then, we've grown, and today we have customers all over the globe. Next. Put simply, I mean, we exist because there's a huge gap in cybersecurity, and that gap only continues to grow. Traditional education and certs are very important. We all have them, but that's just not enough. OJT is just really not an option. It's not practical. So what's needed really is experience, and we help seek to solve for that. Now, in relation to IT and OT, these systems are getting more intertwined, more interconnected, and quite often there's just differing conflicts and objectives that occur. That results in a lack of ownership often, and quite often really a lack of understanding about what the attack vectors look like and how to remediate against those attacks. Next slide, please. So we know these systems are crucial, but being increasingly dependent upon these systems creates a lot of challenges because the attack surface is just getting larger and larger and more complex, and that's not going to change. So what are the consequences? Next slide. Well, in a recent survey of utilities and oil and gas executives, a majority said disruptions affected their supply chains for at least 4 days, averaged about 4.5, 5. And it took somewhere between $5 to $11 million each instant to remediate these attacks. So, with that backdrop, we'll explore an attack that occurred on a Florida water treatment facility. And with that, I'll turn it over to Pedro. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Mike. Hello, everyone. Thanks for your time. Thanks for joining us today for today's session. We're going to look over an attack that happened in 2011. So let me make sure. There you go. It took place in 2021 against an industrial control system, specifically a water system in Florida. Now, we're going to look at some weaknesses that the attackers found. As we do that, by no means do I want to minimize how challenging it is to perform an attack. nor how challenging it is to defend a network. We're just going to look at some things, some lessons learned that we can apply as we attempt to protect our environments. One of the things that we're going to find in this particular attack was the fact that they had outdated operating systems, right? And that was leveraged against this particular entity. Also, this happens a lot with the ICS environments where corporate access or access from our corporate network to our ICS environment can happen without firewall segregation. So those were two of the things that the attackers were able to leverage on this incident. Now, just so you know, the attackers were able to alter the levels of sodium hydroxide. Now, humans are not are not built to process or handle those chemicals. These are chemicals that are often added to clean the pipes where the water is flowing through. By them increasing those levels, that could have cost the lives of humans. Now, just so you know, thankfully, one of the employees realized something was off before this water was allowed to be consumed by humans. So thankfully, no deaths took place, but had this particular employee not realized what was happening, this could have caused the loss of life. And I want to point that out because as we look at the damages of the impact that OT environments and attacks of the OT platform can produce, you know, we cannot overlook the fact that it could also impact human life. Now, this happened in 2021, but just to give you a point of reference, last month, there was attacks to water systems. CISA reported that there are particular PLCs developed by Israeli companies that are being targeted by Iranian hackers, for example. And also just last week, Ireland, the city of Iris, suffered an attack that kept that city without water for 2 days. So why does this happen? Well, one of the challenges is that often government entities, government organizations lack the funding required to keep the systems up to date and secure. So for that reason and many others, we see this as something that is happening on a consistent basis. Now, a couple more things that we found in this particular attack. They were using TeamViewer. Many of you may be familiar with it. It's a tool to remotely access systems in the network, access in the network. The access to this TeamViewer tool was using the same password for all environments. So surely enough, that's a problem. The fact that they had a Windows 7 in their environment. This is an outdated operating system. Maybe you guys know this already, but what that means is that no security updates are going to be released for that operating system. So whatever weaknesses it has, unless they happen to purchase an extended package, they're not going to receive, they're not going to have. Also, TeamViewer was present in their inventory, though it was not being used, right? So having the desktop sharing software brings with it certain challenges. But if it's something that you're not going to use to begin with, well, then why have it? And then the fact that an attacker could make its way from a corporate environment into the industrial control system environment. So those were things that were exploited on this particular incident. Now, what I'm showing you here, this is an this is an alert from our environment. In Cloud Range, we run attacks such as this, and we give the team an opportunity to be exposed to what it would be like, and maybe some of the alerts that could help and enable the security team to defend against this particular attacks and many others. Right? In this case, we see scanning being performed in the environment, and here we have an example of that from our IDS Security Onion, and this would be some of those reconnaissance pieces, active reconnaissance, right? That the security team could begin to identify and realize that, hey, something is happening in our environment. Now here's an additional alerts. This one, port 3389, again, as many of you may know, is the RDP port. So why would someone be scanning and looking to make their way through that port. Maybe it could be an authorized technician, or it could be indicative that something is happening, that someone is trying to take advantage of a particular protocol. So again, just showing you examples of alerts that are being able to be reviewed and kind of analyzed by a team, right? And to be able to do that in an environment that is safe, right? An environment that we can play and practice like the real world is very valuable. Now, so in this particular case, what are the things that could have been done to prevent this from happening? Well, of course, making sure that we're not utilizing outdated operating systems. Number two, we know that passwords, even as good as we may think we are in coming up with clever ideas for passwords, we know that, hey, we're just not good at it, right? So we need to implement other authentication factors, and that's where a multi-factor or 2FA come to mind. Of course, you're always going to have one or two passwords, right? So just make sure that you're following best practices, using phrases, that it's a lengthy password, things like that. Ensuring that not only is your operating system up to date, your firewalls have firmware. That has to be kept up to date. So that's also important. You may have antivirus on your systems. Well, those need definitions that are updated constantly. So basically, all these things require systems, operating systems, versions required to be maintained and kept up to date. Another thing that comes to mind is auditing your network, realizing which ports are open and why, which services are running and why. All these are things that you need to be aware of so that you can protect against it, or even make a determination that, hey, I don't need this running, right? But if you don't audit your network, you may not realize that, hey, we got port 22 open on a server that has no need for it, right? Also, making sure that you're isolating certain sensitive systems in your network. Now, here's some additional mitigation recommendations. We talked about MFA. We talked about limiting RDP, right? Again, there may be business reasons to allow our technicians to connect remotely to our systems. Well, we need to implement multi-factor authentication for that. We may require them to be in the VPN to do that, right? So anytime there are some things that you cannot do without, right? In the case of that, we need to have compensating controls that come in and allow us to do that in a secure manner. We need to audit logs, right? Anytime that someone's remotely accessing our environment or connecting through those type of protocols, we need to audit and ensure that the folks and the activity taking place through those channels is authorized. Also, we need to make sure we're training our workforce on how to identify social engineering and how to properly report that. One of the things that come to mind recently, there was a new technique in which the button that folks use to report phishing attacks was weaponized, right? So that is something new that users need to be aware. Otherwise, they're going to keep using the same old methods. Also, we need to understand what's normal behavior in our environment. So being able to identify when unusual activity is happening on our network is very, very important. And not only identify that, but being able to take a remediation action such as suspending access or disabling an account. Now, I'm listing some things here now that are very particular to an industrial control system, to a water system. These are physical cybersecurity type of techniques, right? What these items do is they make it such that it's much harder to perform an attack. You have pressure switches that when changes are made to the chemical mixture, they set up an alert or an alarm. You have gearing valves, which require manual intervention, right? They cannot be remotely changed, right? Also, looking at the size of a chemical reservoir is important to understand what physical security it requires. Does it need a a guard? Does it need security dogs? Does it need fencing, right? All these things are techniques that are very unique to this type of systems, and that kind of go beyond just the cyber things that come to our mind, but physical things that we can do to protect that environment. Now, in the case that you have a legitimate need to have something like TeamViewer in your network for your technicians, for example, well, make sure that you're not just leaving that unattended, that you just not allowing for default configuration that allows something like this to permit easy access. Maybe you need to configure manual start, right? You don't want this type of tools to just start automatically within your network. So as I mentioned before, there are legitimate needs for some of these protocols, some of these tools, but you have to make sure that you're implementing other controls in place that make it more secure. Instead of having the same password, right, across the environment, make sure you have passwords that are complex and that rotate, right? You know, and everyone has a different idea or thought on how often they rotate, but please just make sure they rotate. Additional ideas when you are permitting TeamViewer for being used in your environment, making sure that by default, maybe it's only view only, and then the particular user has to authorize or permit further access into your environment. Now, as we can see, there is significant risk associated with inadequate cybersecurity of industrial systems. Mike mentioned many of those. We also added the fact that there are lives involving this. So you have to make sure that all these kind of simple things that we can do to prevent an attack, that we're being proactive in performing them. And again, I say simple, but understanding how challenging it is. But when it comes to an outdated software or operating system, that's something we should be on top of it, right? When it's about a software that can allow remote access to other assets, and it turns out we don't need that software, well, we should remove it from our inventory. When it comes to allowing access within our network, we have to make sure that we're segregating our network and that it's not a flat network where people can make their way from corporate, to finance and to other more sensitive environments. Now, security tends to be very reactive, right? We're often responding to an alert. We're often responding to someone reporting an item to our attention. It is critical that we take a more proactive approach, right? And that we are performing scans, we're performing auditing, right? And those simple things that attackers can become aware of, that we become aware of first and take proactive measures to defend against them. Now, additional ideas and additional things that we can implement for security, implementing whitelisting. What that means is that we have a list of authorized applications in our environment, right? That we're performing patch management and configuration management. One thing I want to say here, there's a wrong idea that believes that everything can be addressed with a patch, right? There are some things that can be addressed with patching. Now, other things require a configuration change or require a compensating control in order to overcome its weakness. Of course, we want to reduce our attack surface, right? And we talked about protocols and ports and services, right? And limiting those things are ways that we can reduce that attack surface. We want to build an environment that's defendable, right? We want to have layers of security as we realize that, hey, one security mechanism may fail, but if I have a layer approach, I improve the chances of catching things, even if one of my security mechanisms is compensated. We want to make sure that we have a legitimate way of authenticating our users, right? We want to make sure that we can confirm that our users are who they say they are. And then that we also are making sure that we're authorizing the level of access that they have within our environment. We got to monitor, right? We have to constantly monitor and respond to incidents. If we're going to allow for remote access, it has to be in a secure fashion. And then we have to recognize potential attacks and how to respond to that. Training and environments and solutions such as Cloud Range really enable teams to be proficient against such incidents. All right. I think I felt like I was going fast. My apologies. I really want to make sure that I went through everything within time and that we had a few minutes at least to go over any questions you guys may have. Russell, great question. I have to ask Michelle for that answer. The question from Russell is, would the recording be available for download and replay?
The recording will be available on our website shortly after.
Oh, outstanding. Well, thank you, Michelle. I'm repeating just in case her audio is low on my end, but she's saying it will be available on our website shortly after the presentation.
It looks like we have another question here.
Sure.
Are there any notable trends or patterns in cyber threats targeting critical infrastructure?
So if you ask me, based on this last couple of weeks, the Iranian hacking group that's been attacking ICS environments, they have come after anyone that has water systems developed by Israel. So they're coming after any country that has that country as a vendor for their water systems.
Another question that we have here is, what specific skills and knowledge should cyber defense teams develop to effectively protect industrial control systems?
Great question. One of the things that come to my mind, right, is first understanding those two environments, right, and realizing there's an IT environment, there's an OT environment that is more and more connected. So understanding how is it that an authorized user, for that matter, can make its way from the IT to the OT network, right? And by understanding how an authorized user can authenticate itself and make its way from one environment to the other, I think that will enable that team to then realize when an authenticated user is trying to perform that. Hope that helped. I think there's a lot more to that question, Mike, in case you wanted to add something.
Well, I would simply say that there's organizational challenges as well, because quite often there's an IT security organization and an OT security organization, and quite often those two organizations don't quite have the same risk priorities or objectives. So from a management level, it seems incumbent that you would want to get those two teams, if there are two teams, kind of on the same page. And I know we've discovered many instances where the attacks that occurred or have occurred, from just our own personal customer base, have occurred with result of teams not having the same organizational priorities. So just organizationally, I would encourage everyone to have those discussions at the higher level as well. I mean, surely there's technical challenges and technical things that need to be done. There's also organizational and just management objectives that need to be defined and redefined.
Great. Looks like we have one last question, and it's based on your expertise. What do you foresee as upcoming challenges or developments in the cybersecurity landscape for industrial control systems?
I think that Mike brought a great point, right? I think that synergy and that connection between environments and also understanding, we know a lot of tools like IDSs and IPSs for the IT environment. But one of the things that comes to mind, there are particular tools that we have in our environment, for example, Clarity, for example, being one of those, that are now IDSs and IPSs specifically for OT environments. So I think that that's kind of the things we have to keep in mind, right? Understanding how those two technologies are connected and understanding the unique items that may need to be added for protection. And I see a question here. I don't know if you saw it for network architecture, TCP/IP, the bridge, for packet pivoting. Yeah, so for that, Dorian, what comes to mind is that segregation that we talked about, right? Because otherwise, pivoting throughout a network becomes really, really easy for the attacker.
Well, I'll just add to that too that it's not just typical OT ICS. I mean, you can throw IoT devices in there as well, and that attack surface is going to just continue to get larger and larger. So segmenting the network seems an obvious and necessary way to stop some of these attacks from propagating from one side to the other. Any other questions?
No, I think that's it.
Awesome.
Perfect. Well, thank you, everyone. We appreciate your time.
Thank you so much again.